This past week, I was doing a little bit of reading, and then the book that I was reading was about presentation and communication skills, because if you haven't noticed, I do a little bit of that in my life, and I want to get better at it. And one of the lines that I read this week really stood out to me. The author said this. He said, the best teachers or the best presenters elicit a response from their listeners. And then he went on to say that the best presentations take on the form of a question mark. They signal the start of a new thought and a challenge to the listener to get involved and to bring something of themselves into the conversation. And I really feel that our teachers this past month have done just that. And here's how I know. I've heard things from many of you over the last 3 weeks that sounded a little bit like this. I am so hopeful. I am full of hope after hearing all that we have heard. With all the challenges, with all the stretching, the things I need to think about, the things that need to change in my life, the way I need to parent my kids in this area, this has been good. Thanks for being hopeful. Something is afoot in our church to have these kinds of conversations, and again, to join God in this part of God's renewal. And I've also heard different comments from some of you. One I'm going to share with you here with permission from the person who said it to me this week over lunch, a dear, dear friend. I asked him, and we're going to leave him anonymous here, but he said this. He said, when are you going to poke the other side? I feel like you're always poking my side. You're always poking my people. To which I say to him and you, oh, I'm sorry. Are you getting poked at church a little bit? Are you being pushed and stretched and challenged perhaps to handle some things that you haven't thought about? Are you being forced to hold on to what you believe or perhaps vouch for your convictions? If you were being poked, my friends, I say this to you. It's a good thing. Pay attention to those pokes because Jesus is often in those pokes trying to get our attention. Have we covered all the prickly topics that are associated to creation care in this short series? No, we haven't, but we'll get to them. This series was meant to open the conversation, and we'll revisit some of this in the near future. But not only that, this series was designed to remind us that everything and everyone is connected. Everything was intended to exist in harmony. And we've heard that same message loud and clear over the last 3 weeks, and we're going to hear it again this morning. Except this morning, we're going to come at it from a bit of a different angle, and that's why I've invited our new friends to come here this morning and give us a good poke. Just one more poke, okay? Just one more. Joining us today are Rick and Jackie Block. Rick and Jackie are the Saskatchewan representatives of the Canadian Food Grains Bank, an international organization whose goal is a world without hunger. And today, I've invited them to share with us a little bit on the topic of food security. Now, why would we include food security in a series about creation care? Because like we've been saying, everything and everyone is connected. And one of the related outcomes, whether we treat the world well or poorly, is reflected in how well or how poorly humanity eats. So I'm so excited you're here today. You're going to love these guys. Can you give it up for Rick and Jackie this morning? Welcome, friends. So glad you're here. Oh, one more thing, again, to include you in the conversation. During this whole message, that phone number is going to be in the bottom corner there. If you have a question, a thought, something you want to add, text that in. Allison is up top in the booth. She'll collect 2 or 3 of the best questions or maybe amalgamate some of them, and then we'll end our time together with some Q&A. So, Rick, let's start with you, and let's start in a foundational spot. Define food security for us, why it matters, and why it ties into this conversation of creation care.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. And just a good morning to you all. It's very good to be here with you, to worship with you. I see some familiar faces, I think, in the crowd here, so that's also kind of nice to be able to see. And I want to thank the worship team and just... It's always amazing to see how services come together, and I know in the first service too, some of the songs, especially around this sense of God, you are good, really reflects, it mirrors what we read in Genesis, that creation is good. And this isn't good as though like average good, better, best kind of thing. This is good at a values level that, we in some ways just get glimpses of, and we do experience, and in many ways by virtue of the bounty that comes from the earth. And so food security is, it's always at risk of being a term that just stays kind of in an academic realm. And it's important, though, to speak about it in ways that we all can understand kind of at a practical level. And so, as well, I would say at a practical level, and so we also have kind of a common concept that can be shared across whether we're in urban or rural environments, whether we are speaking about Canada, whether we're speaking about Colombia, whether we're speaking about Ethiopia, various parts of the world. It's important to have, I guess, a common concept for food security. And so let's go to this slide where this would be a really kind of a layperson's definition of food security, which really is probably the most effective definition, because then it can actually kind of be retained by us as the people. When all people have regular access to enough nutritious food to lead healthy and active lives. And so a fairly simple statement, but yet I want to just kind of draw our attention to some of the key words there, and just even take just a moment to think about some of the implications on that. All people, the access and its regularity, so regular access, enough, and perhaps we could see that in both ways, enough, and nutritious. And then also kind of the outcome, healthy and active lives. And there's obviously much more to it, but it's also, it is a key element to that aspect of healthy and active lives. Now, perhaps we are prone to think of, well, this is a definition, okay, I understand the definition, but, it kind of doesn't relate to me. I'm not a farmer. I'm not one of these crazy community gardeners, which I am one of them, so I can say it, I guess. I don't work in the ag and food industry. I'm not a researcher, blah, blah, blah. But, we might think, well, that's something removed, or we might think, hey, it's just of interest, kind of to think about it. But I want to suggest that, in fact, and we've been exploring this, that we are all connected. And so my guess is maybe not everyone, but probably most of us had something to eat or drink this morning, or are planning to later today. And I'm sure we plan to tomorrow and the next day. And my guess is we probably don't have, we may not have some very specific barriers that we really feel like, oh, I might not be able to eat tomorrow. And so simply by virtue of partaking in that bounty of the earth, we are connected. I am connected. We used to live in Mexico for a number of years with the Mennonite Central Committee, and a couple of times I would actually get to harvest coffee cherries. That might even sound interesting, but to harvest coffee, by virtue of drinking coffee this morning, and every morning, I am connected to those that are stewarding that landscape. By having that slice of toast, I'm connected, or my oatmeal this morning, I'm connected to those that are farming just on the outskirts of Saskatoon. We are connected, and we do have an influence, maybe small, but aggregated together, we do have an influence on how land is managed and how land is stewarded, how water is stewarded. Now, there is a tension that obviously exists, because we can see that, hey, there's a lot of land in the world that might not be stewarded in an ideal way, and there's a lot of breakdown to the system. And I think in some ways that just simply reflects the brokenness of our world. It reflects the fact or reality that even our best intentions around systems and how to make a large food system work, that there's breakdown. It's incomplete. It doesn't function as it should. And there's lots of reasons for it, and we don't have time to go into all that complexity. But I will note one thing. And this is kind of connected to our brokenness in terms of a world that is impacted by sin. We often, we collectively, there can be a focus on the short term, kind of around the short term gain, the sense of how does it help me, this kind of the sense of security, having a me focus. And that can lead to larger issues around greed, around corruption, even at larger levels, and that always has an impact. And a person needs to ask, where does that cost? Who is bearing the burden of that cost? I'll end this question just with two statements here. Food security matters because food and water are basic necessities of life, but also they are also very important elements to being able to extend hospitality, to being able to convene community, to be able to practice peace building, to even be able to kind of make manifest God's sense of shalom, of justice. And by virtue of that, creation care matters as well, because God essentially delegated the stewardship of his house to men and women, and that includes ensuring that people have access to food.
So that's helpful for us to see it that way, where everything we eat, somebody somewhere did something before it got to us. And I like what you just said towards the end there too, saying that sometimes we do have this short-term gain in mind at the expense of like long-term consequences. So Jackie, maybe pick it up from there and maybe tell us a bit about like why people are food insecure. How does that happen?
Right, and probably just to start out, one idea that we often hear from food producers that study like how much food is in the world, that there is actually enough food for everyone, that we don't need to be nervous about that. Obviously, we need to keep growing it, but we don't need to be nervous about that. But often the issue is the distribution of it and the fair distribution of it, given the word we said before is that not everyone has equal access. And so we have, unfortunately, in a world where there's literally some people that are starved and starving for people that don't have enough food. And we have places in the world, and that's, I'm assuming that most of us experience this, but I recognize there might be people here or people that know people right here in Saskatoon that don't have good access to food. But we tend to be a little bit stuffed. There's an overabundance. So there's the starved and the stuffed, and somewhere in the middle we may find ourselves. But that kind of overabundance is just being aware that sometimes that might lead to things like food waste, or maybe overconsumption. I don't know, but that's the other extreme of something. And so we just have to be aware of where we are coming from. And you might all be on a different spectrum of that. But to be aware that for a lot of us, we come from a place of privilege in which we have never experienced the concern of, I don't know where my next food's going to come from, or I don't know where I'm going to feed the next food to my children. We haven't experienced that. Maybe secondhand you have, but maybe not firsthand. And so we always, when we see other people struggling, I think we just have to be super careful and humble and be respectful of people that we haven't experienced that, and to not make light of people's sufferings and not avoid them, but also just to make sure we're not too simple in saying, well, if you would just do this, it would all be fine. Or, well, if you would just do that, then you'd be fine. Those type of attitudes are not helpful. They're quite hurtful. And thankfully, my experience of God is not looking down on me and saying, well, pull yourself up. What's your problem? Do something and fix yourself. He comes down and he shows compassion over and over again and generosity. And that's God's heart for me. And I think the more we receive that, we can share that. But just to be, that we have to understand where we're coming from and not to make things too simple, because they are quite complex. In every region, whether it's in Canada or Venezuela or Haiti or Lebanon or Sudan, they're all a little bit different. Unfortunately, one of the main things that we're hearing right now about food insecurity and the reasons for the rise of it, unfortunately, in the last few years, is due to conflict in our world. And we probably all are aware of places that come to mind where there's conflict. And so conflict might look for example, I was in Lebanon 2.5 years ago, and just learning and listening to Syrian refugees that have come into the country. And a lot of the stories I heard, not all of them, were people that 10 years ago were food secure. They had businesses, they had jobs, they were education, everything was good, and then that fell apart completely. And they had to flee. And they probably fled to a place maybe in Syria still, where there's so many people without employment, or they're going as refugees where they don't always have the right to work. And so they're just in a real insecure place. Or it might look like the most vulnerable people actually for being food insecure are rural peasant farmers who are subsistence farmers. They rely on their piece of land to feed themselves and their family. And so if there's conflict and you have to leave your land, you have no money in the bank. There's no government insurance or anything to help you. And so you're in a real vulnerable spot. Or you might be aware there's conflict where you live and you're nervous to put money and resources of seed into the ground because you don't know 3 months from now if you're going to be there. So conflict is, unfortunately, there are other things, disasters and things that happen from external forces that impact people for sure. But yeah, conflict. And the UN kind of study on food security kind of released this statement of really understanding right now in our world that without peace, we're not going to have food security. And without food security, we're not going to have peace. And that's just a reality that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you. That's helpful for us, right? Two things you said really stuck out to me was this isn't a pull yourself up by your bootstraps situation. And often that's the message that we hear. You know, you can do whatever you want, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But sometimes that's just not possible. And then I liked also that you helped us understand that food security and peace are linked, and when one of those is out of whack, it creates trouble. Now, but sometimes when we hear that, it feels very far away, right? We're not in Syria, we're not in Sudan, that's far, far away. So Rick, maybe help us understand what food insecurity looks like here in Canada and perhaps in Saskatchewan.
Certainly, yeah, it can be a tendency to think of, the breakdown of systems we often might see in the news that relate to other places in the world, but in fact, when we begin to pay attention, we can recognize that these systems have breakdowns here in Canada as well. And the way in which food insecurity or hunger essentially is manifest here in Canada just perhaps looks a little bit different. To some degree, I think, to some degree an accurate statement would be essentially in Canada food is plentiful but access is a challenge. Again, that's a generalized statement. But I want to provide kind of 3 glimpses into what might be some of the more common areas in which in which there's barriers for people to access food, and by virtue experience hunger. So one would be really remote locations, remote communities. We can think of places in northern Saskatchewan, Fond du Lac, or even South End. I mean, South End is approachable by road, but at times, there might be reasons why food is not able to get into the community. A number of years ago, I worked with an organization called Heifer International, and we did work in some fly-in communities in northern Manitoba. So in God's River, where we had worked with a community group there. The first trip was quite astounding because I went into the northern store, and to see your 4-liter jug of milk cost $16, apples at $6 a pound. Anything that is more in the realm of fresh and wholesome has an incredible price. The other food that has longer shelf life, marginally more expensive, but there's economic reasons why we see that. But still, that represents a significant barrier to accessing the kind of healthy food that one needs. Another scenario would be rural communities, and particularly I'm kind of referencing rural communities in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, many communities where a good amount of the economy is based on resources, natural resources, and a lot of it has frankly got to do with some of the oil resources. And so we've seen a downturn, families who have in some ways lost a lot of their income basis, and essentially these rural communities are reporting food bank use that they would have never maybe even dreamed. And they see the stress of families and communities. And I mean, there are fixed costs such as housing, such as keeping the lights on and it heated. And food is one of those costs that often will fluctuate. And that's where people realize, I can squeeze my dimes a little bit more if I end up going to the food bank. And so that is also a barrier to accessing food. Thirdly, I'd use this term called food deserts. And in some ways, we, to a degree, we have this here in Saskatoon, and it's often found more in city centers, kind of in urban core areas where, you're going to have to walk or bike or drive actually quite a distance to actually get to a store that sells food, fresh food. Sometimes there's convenience stores, but again, what kind of, where's the healthy food in order to encourage our physical health, that can be a distance. And for those that may be a single parent who's working at or near minimum wage and maybe doesn't even have a vehicle, the idea of having to spend between $30 and $50 going to and from a grocery store in order to access food, already on a tight budget, that can be a cost that presents itself as a barrier. I'll end this question just with a story. Jackie and I, with the Food Grains Bank, we're often in spaces, especially with middle years, because food security is part of the curriculum. We'll do various activities. The Food Grains Bank, we have this kind of fun little board game. It's called Breaking the Cycle of Hunger. And it's essentially for students to get a little bit of a glimpse in terms of what is it like for a resource-poor farmer in a developing nation, and what are the factors that can really curtail getting out of that cycle of hunger, or what are the factors that help exit that cycle. And over the course of the game, this is a grade 7 girl that came up to us at the end, just kind of in private, and she said, "I get this," and that kind of hit the heart a little bit. Here's a family that she too understands that there's these conditions, that there's these larger barriers that sometimes prevent her own family from accessing food.
So what I'm hearing from you here is that this is very much a cycle that people are trapped in, and then when they have kids, their kids are trapped in it as well. So you shared a couple of stats with me when we visited a few weeks ago, and I'd like to share them with our church this morning and have you speak to them. Jackie, we'll do the first one with you, and then Rick next. So Jackie, help us understand this. You said that the first 1,000 days of life establishes the blueprint for a child's development. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so what we're talking right here is about the nutrition element. So not just enough calories, but nutritional food in order to be healthy and active. And yeah, that first 1,000 days, so we're talking from conception until a child's maybe just about 2. And if you don't have the right nutrition food, it's really going to impact development. I mean, we have so much development that happens in the womb and in those first few years. And so we're focusing on trying to make sure young children, pregnant mothers, nursing mothers are getting the right nutrition so that development, that brain development, that physical development, because if that doesn't happen, that's impacting an entire person's life. And if you think of families or communities all suffering from that potential lack of development, like that has way more repercussions down the road. And one of the things, unfortunately, with children, Rick said once when he was in Rwanda that a guide kind of comment to him is you can kind of tell a bit of the health of a community is how active the children are. And so when you come into a community, typically, people south and live outdoors so much, you'll see them running around or coming to welcome you, and they're not. If you don't see them, unfortunately, they're not inside playing with an iPod. They might not have the energy. And if their families are dependent on having the energy to work their land, then that's just, again, that whole cycle. Unfortunately, we also have issues in lots of places in the world where we can have people have way enough calories, maybe in overabundance, and they're obese, but they're actually malnourished. So that can also be a reality. That's a little bit that we have to look at.
And that's a global stat. Let's do a Canadian one here, Rick. That as the wealth of Canadians has increased, giving has decreased. That includes sharing financial or time. And when I've talked to some of my friends who are in the financial sector, and this is tax time, and they look at people's givings, they're discouraged because it's dropping off. So maybe talk to us a bit about that, and let me know when you want me to throw up that chart.
Sure. Yeah, that is something that has, I guess, been talked about more by people, definitely in the nonprofit sector, in the financial sector, and we can put the slide up here. This trend over the last 30, 40 years where essentially wealthy developed countries, as wealth has increased within those countries, the degree to which these countries are responding to those in need has actually decreased. And the details here, really, this is just kind of a glimpse of an example. Canada used to be giving close to 0.7% of its gross national income to international assistance, essentially. And that has slowly gone down and down. I mean, Canada continues to have that as its benchmark, as its target. But as you can see, many countries, to some degree, have faltered in that. And there's lots of reasons for that. But as you mentioned, folks who do tax and stuff will even note that even at an individual level, this is often reflected as wealth increases. Our tendency to be generous, in fact, sometimes decreases. Now, I'm sharing this not to make anyone feel too squirmy, or it's not about shame or anything, but in some ways, the whole point of sharing it is to then perhaps, particularly as the Christian church, as Christ followers, the question in a sense is, from where do we derive our security? How do I use my money? What relationship do I have with my money? And so that is in some degree perhaps questions that we can, that they do make us feel unsettled, but I think they're good and worthwhile questions to ask. I do also want to point out, in some sense, when we look at this, we might think, oh wow, are we all becoming, is this me? Well, in some ways, I have a good spoiler. There are many that are outside of this trend. There are many outliers. We know many through Saskatchewan in our work with the Food Grains Bank. I have no doubt there are many people sitting here that are outliers of that and that are giving, beyond that, and are understanding and appreciating that generosity, and are wanting to, or appreciating the blessing that they receive from God, and are wanting to extend that to another.
You've just put a lot on the table for us. But if we've never experienced food, I've never experienced food insecurity. It's hard to understand all that's at play. So with that in mind, Jackie, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. What do you think the role of the church is in hearing the voice of the marginalized here? Because that's who we're talking about. And what do you think those voices would say to us?
Yeah, I'm just so thankful that you're asking the question here today, and just simply about what you're doing. That's, starting what you're doing, and then to keep doing that, and to keep paying attention to that, to hear other voices, to create space. I often think marginalized people, they're not going to make space for themselves. So if we're not making space for them, and believing that by actually hearing them, it'll be a benefit for everyone. And so we just have to really, I think too, in paying attention, I would say pay attention with God in prayer, as a way of trying to deal with the uncomfortableness about our own uncertainty about how to respond. Yeah, to pay attention together as a community, and to do that with God in prayer, I think would be super helpful. And to trust those messages in the Word that said, if you're giving unto the least of these, you're giving unto me. That's a truth there that we need to pay attention to. Or that the blessed, the poor are blessed. If we don't believe that, then we might not find what is their blessing. Maybe it's not food security, but maybe there's a blessing that they have to share with us that could be super blessing to our hearts if we just gave them space to speak.
We want to throw up that next slide here. Maybe you can speak to this a little bit.
Yes, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. But just as far as how do we respond to people when we talk about hearing the voice of the marginalized? When it comes to listening to marginalized in respect of food security, what we're talking about is 820 million people in our world. That's 1 in 9 who are facing some level of hunger, maybe one meal or less a day, and so. To speak for other people, that's a hard place for me. But I did want to say a few things I think they would say from what I've heard is be thankful. Be thankful for what you have, for the fact that you don't have to worry about where food's going to come from. And enjoy that food, but give thanks for that food, to God that faithfully allows you to eat that food, and the ways that He gives you resources to provide that food for your family. I think they would also say thank you for your generosity, for those of you that are willing to step into those difficult places and to share what you have to others. I know it makes a big impact. Those Syrian women that I still remember sitting with and said, please tell people that we're thankful. So hear that message, and hopefully that stirs your heart to keep being generous. I also think that they have lots, if we could hear what they've learned about resilience and hope in emotionally, insecurity brings a whole lot of things, hunger issues, but also emotional trauma. And to hear some of the resilience and the hope that people have could be really maybe inspiring, I think, to us. And then this last slide you can put up. To do what you keep doing when you're trying to integrate, how do we think about meeting people's practical needs with their spiritual needs, and not seeing those as two different things, but integrating them and talking about earth care as you talk about your spirituality. That's maybe what it would look like here. For this gentleman who is a pastor that works in a food grains project, helping farmers to grow more and better of their own food, this is what he would have to say. I've realized as a pastor that a hungry person will not listen to the word of God. When someone is hungry, they cannot receive that message. And so again, integrating those two things and working together with God and providing for people.
So then, Rick, now what? What do we do with all this? What are some of the practical things we can do or to be aware of to help us join in on the work that God is already doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in some ways, perhaps, we often, in facilitating, it's often what, so what, and now what. And that now what, how do we begin to take that next step is really important. And I'm going to go back to the first week. We were watching this online, and something that really stuck out that Joe mentioned, things change when we take notice. I think that's so very true. And, we can read that in the biblical narrative of, how does God prompt people to begin to take notice? And we live now, in the reality of the New Testament. And so we have the comforter, the helper, the guide, who spurs us on to take notice. So I think awareness is a really important first step. And the writer in Proverbs puts it very well in the first chapter, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think in some ways there is such a strong foundation in beginning from that point. Obviously, I don't have time to further unpack some of that. One other saying I'd like to share here, and this comes out of currently, I've seen this more on social media, and we had done a number of years, we were in Mexico with Mennonite Central Committee, and so I still kind of stay a little bit plugged into some of the folks and networks that we have there. So currently in a lot of Latin America, there is a saying that many of the churches are using as a way to kind of promote people to think about creation care. And translated to English, it essentially goes, to care for creation, what we need are many people doing creation care imperfectly, more than a few people doing it perfectly. I hope you kind of get the little bit of the play on words and a bit of the sentiment. Don't feel that there's all these things, there'd be this expectation, I got to do this and that and the other thing. How do you begin to do it imperfectly, knowing that we will never reach that perfection in doing it, and we need more people to do it. And so the invitation in that sense becomes, what can you do? What could you do? Or what could we do? And I hesitate to, I really wouldn't give recommendations here because we're all unique individuals. We have unique circumstances. But I want to share a few just maybes, presupposes. Let me throw out 3 things here just as examples, and perhaps they spur some thinking for you in your own life. So one would be, maybe you begin thinking about how to steward your space, perhaps somewhat differently. That could be indoor spaces, it could be outdoor spaces. I know for me, a lot of it is around the yard, thinking about how can it be somewhat productive? How could it be more productive? How can it be inviting to extend hospitality to others, to provide at least some things during the growing season? How do we even care for our community spaces? And so maybe you decide to become one of those crazy community gardeners. Another maybe would be, how do we consider approaching our meal times? Thinking about the appreciation of that blessing of food that comes to us. And God is the source of that food, having created this good world. But it also comes to us on the basis of many hands, of much labor. And frankly, sometimes it comes to us in ways that maybe food was produced, maybe we don't totally agree with, and yet it still comes to us and it is still nourishing us. And there's kind of a humbling, I think, aspect to that. And I would put this one in here kind of for my kids' sake in some ways. How do we, maybe we think creatively on utilizing our leftovers in the fridge and, making those unique soups or casseroles as a way to kind of limit the amount of food that gets wasted. And I want to add one more maybe here, group efforts. Combining resources, talents, skills, passions, doing things that can have very practical results in relation to alleviating hunger, or in relation to extending hospitality, in relation to growing in our sense of generosity, and showing care. We can go to this next slide. In the Food Grains Bank circles, we're often asked, what can we do? And again, we don't really ever want to delve into specifics because that's up to the individual. But we do say, here's 4 kind of vectors or actions that we would encourage people to do. To pray, to give, to learn, and to advocate. And I think, I was thinking about these in the last few days, and this is how I would describe these. These are all unique. They're different from one another. There's no hierarchy here. They all have incredible value. They all are expressed in the biblical narrative, in Scripture. And they all have a long and proven track record. And so that was something I would really connect with. One final quick, maybe just a short story a story of Jackie and I that connected with a family north of Saskatoon here who have been very generous over many years. And 2 elder sisters we were meeting with. The eldest sister had passed away. They were sharing a bit about their life growing up. Certainly lots of hardship as children, as teenagers, experiencing hunger, just economic hardship. And yet being so generous. And I can't remember exactly the question that we posed in some ways, what some of the motivation. But their response was simple. In humility, it's simple but yet profound. And they said, we have enough to live on, so why wouldn't we help another who doesn't? And that really kind of speaks to, in some sense, the heart of the matter. I'm going to conclude here. In some sense, Jackie has a real gift of asking good reflective questions. And I will conclude, in some sense, in your vein of good questions that maybe cause us to keep thinking about it. How do we create space in our lives to be more generous? And I believe that applies to this whole realm of food security, as it does many other realms of life.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And as we transition to our question and response time and give those in the booth a chance to get organized, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I really like you guys. I really do. When I first came to your house 2-3 weeks ago, it was one of those minus 44 days. There was a real warmth in your house. When we talked about these kinds of things and you shared about what you're doing, you need to know that what you're doing is important. It helps the church, capital C, get on track with what God cares about. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for teaching us today. Can we give it up for our new friends here really quick here? It's good? Yeah? Thank you. Thank you. Are you ready for the first question here? Jackie will talk to you. They're generally nice people, but I don't know what's coming up, so we'll just see what happens. Okay, here we go here. First question is this. What are practical steps we can take to rearrange our food habits to support food security?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that's been helpful to me, and goes back to when I lived in Mexico, is who do you relate with as far as maybe someone that has a different experience with access to food to you? Because if you live in an echo chamber of thinking that, well, everyone has all this, and that's the only narrative you're hearing, it's really hard to think that, oh, maybe I should change, or maybe there would be a different way. And so spending time with different people and understanding where they're at might be a super helpful thing. And we also joked, we pulled out our MCC More with Less, Mennonite Central Committee More with Less cookbook while Joe was over.
Can you get me one? Because I've been trying to find one.
I know we're trying, and Miriam's trying to work on that too. I really do believe that there is a narrative that we need to hear that sometimes more with less, that you can actually have more if you do with less. And that's so contrary to how we think. But I think if we all say it to one another, maybe we have a better chance of believing and finding some ways to live that out.
Which is amazing because I live the opposite, right? How much more can I get with more? Or what you said earlier about, inviting, eating people who aren't in your same, food class, maybe. I'd never do that. That's never happened. But that's a great way to approach it. Thank you. One more question. Do you think you can do as well as she did? We're going to find out. All right, throw up that next question, Allison. Here it is. So how do we balance our dependence on natural resources, especially in the Saskatchewan economy, and our call as Christians to look after the earth? Is there a way to grow our economy and provide jobs for people as well as look after the earth? That's a big one.
You guys ready for a seminar? No, not that I could necessarily give it, but yeah, these are good questions. I'm glad these questions come out. Particularly, my background is soil science. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. I have a real soft spot for the way that God created the earth, and it's really important that we can live in a manner to seek the well-being of not only ourselves but each other. Now, that's the general statement. To some degree, one of the first things that comes to my mind in the first part of the question, or in that first upper half, is I think it's really important as the church, as Christ followers, not to be pulled too far into the encampments of either, politically, small p, either the right or left camps, or maybe I should say it in this way, not to be pulled so far into really strong ideologies. It's not that those ideologies, I don't believe, are wrong, but they often will kind of bring us onto a different path than the reality of so many people, of what people are experiencing. And so in some sense, I think, how do we enter into the experiences of people such as this girl in Kindersley, such as this pastor in Kenya? How do we come at it from the more kind of practical, pragmatic approach? And then, frankly, we have the gift of being together as a community in God's Spirit, along with God's Spirit. How does He lead us in that? God is infinitely creative. God will not be defined by the ideological responses on one side or the other. And I think we have to trust that. Practically, in terms of growing our economy and providing jobs, that is a tough one. I think because in some sense, as I mentioned, our brokenness a bit of our systems, even the way we do kind of economics, we often are looking at certain timelines, and perhaps we're not accounting for certain costs that are happening, not just over a 50-year period, but, over maybe 200 years. And our models tend not to be able to incorporate that. And how do we don't monetize mercy and grace. We never should. But these are elements that are important aspects of how we do life together, but they don't really factor into the numbers on an economic spreadsheet.
Very helpful. Here it is. Question is, where should we give our money if we want to support food security? Do you have tips for what we should look for in organizations? Do you work for anything like that? I'm wondering.
That's boy, if anyone from the Food Grains Bank would notice that I wouldn't say the Canadian Food Grains Bank, they'd be disappointed.
You better say it, because this is going online, so you better say it.
Definitely, I would. I mean, there's many organizations that do a lot of work around food security. The Canadian Food Grains Bank is one. There is a unique feature in terms of the Government of Canada that matches all donor dollars up to 4 to 1 because of the work that we do internationally, and so it really does. It really magnifies the donation in that sense. But there's many organizations that do work internationally, locally. Locally, I've been connected to CHEP for many years in various capacities.
What's CHEP?
CHEP Good Food. It's a local organization. It used to be known as Child Hunger Education Program. Now everyone just kind of calls it CHEP. They do a good food box. And they do a lot of school lunch programs because we don't have any, kind of either national or provincial level school lunch programming. So CHEP does that for low-income neighborhoods here in Saskatoon. Again, the Food Grains Bank is actually a unique way by virtue of the many agencies that work around it or that are part of it.
Yeah, can I just say, I'm just going to jump in that one of the things, and it's either the Food Grains Bank or others, but look for people that work with local partners, because then there's just so much more relationship and understanding of the complexity of the issue that's going on, and then more assurance that how they're going about it is not just that they're getting food, but how they're going about it is dignified for the people that are receiving it.
Can we thank our friends one more time for sharing with us?